Hi, I'm Don Dizon. I'm a professor of medicine and professor of surgery at Brown University, and I'm thrilled to be here with you to deliver this talk specific to equity in cancer care as it relates to the LGBTQ population. I thought I'd first start by just explaining real quickly the differences between equality and equity. It's a big a distinction that we spend a lot of time talking about here in the United States because I think there's a perception that they're the same. But in reality, they are not. So, equality, if you just look at this figure, everybody in the world, everybody in this picture deserves a bike. Everyone should have a bike. Doesn't matter, if they're handicapped, if they're short, tall, it doesn't matter. Everyone gets a bike. It doesn't matter if you can actually use the bike as long as you get one. That's equality. Equity takes into account all of the things that make us different and tries to normalize the field so that we can benefit from the same things in the same way. So adjustments to the bike so that someone who's short can use it, very tall can use it, and someone who is handicapped can use it. That displays the principle of equity. So equity is really what we are striving for when it comes to medicine, when it comes to policy, because we want a society across the globe where everyone is treated as equals. And this is relevant in the LGBTQ space because the concepts, although are oftentimes lumped together, are actually quite diverse. The community is very diverse. Just like if you say, what is going on in the Latinx or the Hispanic community, that is an incredibly diverse community. The same thing is true in the LGBTQ space. And this is sort of identified in this very now sort of historical concept of the genderbread person. So when you think of the LGBTQ community, it's in multiple domains. It's in their gender identity, but it can also be in their gender expression and how one expresses themselves in a gender defined way, which, by the way, is defined through a societal lens that doesn't inform their identity. And their identity may or may not be informed by their biological sex, sometimes called their sex assigned at birth, and certainly is not the same thing as sexual orientation. So this really displays how identity can go from women to man, but in the middle, there may be this genderqueer persona. The expression may be very feminine or masculine, or may be androgynous. And the biological sex, we now know that there is an intermediate of an intersex biological assignment between female and male. And then sexual orientation, which is really simplified on this figure, is heterosexual, bisexual, and homosexual. These are all very broad categories, but there are nuances in all of them that are encompassed within the LGBTQ community. This is important in a medical standpoint, especially in an oncology standpoint, because the SGM community, the sexual and gender minoritized community, remains invisible. This is a study I did with colleagues from oncology, led by Ash Alpert, where we looked at CancerLink, which is a database informed by community practices within the United States. And it has the health records of over 1 million people. The aim was to identify transgender people captured in medical records. And the catchment rate, just by going through charts, was only 0.003%. This is probably 100 to 1,000 fold lower than an expected incidence would be given the population numbers in the United States. In addition, this is because within CancerLink, as well as within contemporary databases as we collect in the United States, whether that be something called the SEER database, Surveillance Epidemiology and Results database, SEER, which is the basis of a lot of our population-wide studies, and the National Cancer Database, or the NCDB. None of these databases collect sex or gender data. So we can't inform incidence. We can't analyze outcomes by either sex, gender, or gender identity. We can't even evaluate for toxicity. And this is even a bigger issue and a more pressing issue that I'll get to later for trans individuals. The other reason this is important is because the disparities exist because there are hostilities present. This is a study that looked at a cohort of people who identified as part of the LGBTQ community, and then specifically looking at the experience of people who were transgender. If you see this, among LGBTQ people, the incidence was around 10%, where the hostilities varied between refusals to be seen, refusals to render care, being spoken to harshly, or being touched inappropriately, around 8 to 10%. But if you were trans, those numbers almost triple, or go to 10 to 30%. So this is the realized experience of the sex and gender minoritized community in medicine. Now, when you take that experience, and now they're dealing with a cancer diagnosis, which oftentimes requires a multidisciplinary, a multi-specialty approach, there's a lot of anxiety and maybe even some delays in care because of the hostilities experienced. And it translates into a discriminatory environment for LGBTQ people. Now, this compares SGM people, sex and gender minoritized communities, in the light green to the experience by race. And if you see, Black Americans still report discrimination and also avoid healthcare due to a fear of discrimination. It's less so, but still pretty significant, almost 20% in Latino and Native American communities. The group that experiences and avoids healthcare the lowest, 5%, is among white individuals, Asians around 10%. But if you look at the light green figures, it's over 15% report discrimination, and over 50% are avoiding healthcare because of the fear. And this is greater than what is experienced by Latino and Native Americans. So this slide alone represents the disparities in care that is almost or even greater than what is experienced by race. One of the reasons that this exists is likely because there's a bias at play for those of us rendering care. This was a very interesting study of over 4,000 heterosexual medical students being trained in the United States. They used something called the implicit association test to evaluate for both explicit and implicit biases. Actually, for explicit biases, they used this feeling thermometer, sort of showed a picture and said, how does this make you feel? And then they, gauge that. But for implicit bias, they use this thing called the implicit association test, which tested phrases towards sentiment in a way that wasn't directly comparative. It's a very interesting test, and you can do it beyond sex and gender minority. You can do it for attitudes or implicit bias around obesity or race, or in this case, gender. But what they found was very shocking. If you look at the sense of just being overtly biased, explicitly, and homophobic, or anti-LGBT almost half of US based medical students had that bias against gay and lesbian individuals, compared to a Caucasian data set where they, showed pictures and phrases that were related to white people. 46% more students had a bias against LGBTQ people. And the thermometer, that feeling thermometer of 0 being cold, 100 being very hot, the ratings were significantly lower for gays and lesbians compared to the ratings for Caucasians. When it came to just implicit bias, so the feelings that one has and is not aware of it, which can then inform how you interact with people, almost inadvertently, okay? Nearly everyone had an implicit bias against gays and lesbians. Over 80% of these medical students, who, by the way, remember, are the future physicians within the US, 80% had an implicit bias against gay and lesbians, and only 14% of US medical students exhibited no evidence of explicit or implicit bias. This goes to show how ingrained anti-LGBTQ feelings are, even when people are not directly aware of it. This plays out then in how LGBTQ people experience healthcare. Assumptions are being made about this community, such as these, that, if you don't have sex with men, then you don't need pap smears. It's a real missed cancer prevention and cancer screening opportunity. Only gay men get anal cancer, restricts a whole group of people, including lesbians, from screening and early detection for anal cancer. LGBTQ people also are not interested in having children, means that when they are diagnosed with cancer, you are less likely to offer fertility preservation options. Partners aren't important unless they are married. And while gay marriage is legal in the United States, not all gay people want to be married. So there is then this assumption, if you don't want to get married, then they're not that important to you, and hence I don't have to include them in your medical decisions. There is that invalidation of non-traditional relationships that still is present in society. And that for people taking gender-affirming hormone therapy and get cancer, that you are yourself to blame because you took those hormones. The realities are far from this. Women who have sex with women, lesbians, get cervical cancer. HPV, which is the causative factor of cervical cancer in over 90% in the United States and as high proportions across the globe, does not discriminate by sexual orientation. You can get HPV at any time in your life. Lesbians are no exception, and they should get screening. Anal cancer is not associated with gay men as a risk factor. Anal cancer is associated with risk factors, including HPV and anal intercourse. So those are either infections or activities. Being gay does not make you at increased risk of anal cancer. Between 2 and 4 million children have at least one gay parent in the United States, and 200,000 are being raised in a same-sex household. LGBTQ people are having children, and they are interested in fertility, and we need to make sure that that is the baseline we go by, rather than saying they're not interested, because so much is lost when you take away the knowledge around fertility preservation when someone is diagnosed with cancer. This association between marriage and legitimacy is what is sometimes referred to as a heteronormative concept, we were all ingrained to believe you find your opposite sex partner, you marry, you have children, grandchildren, and then you die. That is a heteronormalcy. This is what we overall grew up to believe we want. And while many of us, including myself, wanted marriage and children, this is not the same across the world. In fact, within the LGBTQ community, there are families that they define for themselves, and there are relationships that don't fall into these constructs, but it does not make it any less important. And then in terms of transgender people on gender affirming hormone therapy, realize that in the limited data we have, there is no increased cancer risk with gender affirming hormone therapy. Now, that can be a fairly controversial statement. For example, there is a study that was done in Europe that showed among transgender women taking gender affirming hormone therapy, so men taking gender affirming hormone therapy to realize that their gender as a woman were at an increased risk of breast cancer. But the comparator group in that study was cisgendered men. Okay. So if you're a man taking hormones, estrogen therapy to become a woman, there is going to be an increased risk of breast cancer if you're comparing them to men who do not take estrogen. But if you take that same group of transgender women taking estrogen and compare them to cisgendered women, there is no increased risk of breast cancer. So a lot of it has to do with how we frame the question and also analyze the results. What we have done at the American Society of Clinical Oncology is try to provide guidance on how we can remove barriers, remove or address the disparities to bring equity, at least in the clinical trial landscape. And one of the ways we've tried to do this, because I was part of this task force, was to identify opportunities to bring inclusion for the SGM communities. Examples of this was the systematic collection of sexual orientation and gender identity, to systematically collect names that participants use and their pronouns, and not to assume pronouns for people. Referring to trial volunteers by their names rather than using Mr. or Miss. And then decoupling. I think this is probably the more important one. Decoupling gender or sex assigned at birth and anatomy with cancer. Cancer does not actually have a gender. So the way this has been done in the past is when we write our trials to say this is a trial open to women with ovarian cancer or men with prostate cancer. That actually excludes trans people. Okay. Or if you can, using language that says this is a trial open to people with breast cancer or people with prostate cancer, that uses non-gendered language, but also breaks that association. And this is a very relevant one in the breast cancer community, where we realized in the last 10 years that men with breast cancer have not been enrolled on clinical trials of breast cancer therapy for no good reason, except that they were men. Because the trials were written as women with breast cancer, there's a very cognizant effort now to remove that gender-specific language in breast cancer studies, because it acknowledges the fact that breast cancer is not a cancer that only impacts women. The other things we've looked at is, whether or not gender-affirming hormone therapy for trans people, whether that should be part of what excludes people from clinical trials. We are asking for a very careful and thoughtful consideration of what should go into a trial, rather than saying all of our trials were written this way, and so we're just going to do that. We want people to really think about what they want to do in this trial and who they can reach in this trial without specifically excluding people who could potentially benefit or join a research experience. So in terms of collection of sexual orientation and gender identity data, this is really one of the most important things, as I talked about previously, because the fact that we are not collecting this data means there's this black hole in the experience of cancer within the community. We cannot tell what that experience is like. We cannot tell if there are differences in outcomes based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And this is a very legitimate question if you just look at the experience of cancer and cancer outcomes by race. So the ability to collect SOGI data in the United States, at least, is available even today. There is no software that is required to allow for this to take place. And this is because back in 2015, for these electronic health record systems to become certified by the Center for Medicare Services, they had to have a SOGI screens embedded in their system to allow for the collection of sexual orientation and gender identity. What was not included in that was any kind of mandate or certification requiring sites, hospitals, clinicians to collect that data. So while the technology exists, there's nothing to mandate the collection itself. We have a system called EPIC here in Rhode Island, and this is our smart form, which is in the electronic health record, that collects sexual orientation and gender identity. What's important to know here is that one of the main things that we need to think about is whether these should be self-reported or directly asked. And I think that's one of the sticking points in terms of SOGI data collection. But as you can see, it asks for sexuality, legally what the sex was, again, so this is the sex assigned at birth, which is asked specifically here, and also the gender identities, including the option not to disclose, which is important because this allows the form then to be a mandatory form for completion, but allowing patients not to say or disclose what their specificities are. It even goes so far within our system for trans people to do what's called an organ inventory, which it can be very relevant across the board for oncology. If a transgender woman has new breasts, I need to know that. But if they've removed, their penis and prostate, I need to know that if they've had that gender assignment surgery, because I want to know if I should be doing prostate cancer screening. If a transgender man has undergone gender assignment surgery and has removed their breasts, I don't need to do mammograms. But if they have their uterus intact or cervix intact, they still require pap smears. So again, this is why the organ inventory is important. It gets away from gender-associated screening to organ-specific considerations. This is what the National Academy for Science, Engineering, and Medicine recommends in terms of collecting this data. For gender, asking what was the sex you were assigned at birth, female, male, or other, and with other, you can specify and write that in. And then going to, do you consider yourself to be transgender or gender variant? An important phrased question because it's asking you directly to answer that question as it relates to you. What is your perception of gender as it relates to your own life? And it's a simple yes or no, not a labeling exercise, but a yes or no question. In terms of sexual orientation, the NASM recommendation is to phrase it as, do you identify as, give 3 options, or something else. We would probably add one more bullet here saying, choose not to disclose. Okay. But the important point here is that if you're going to ask about sexual orientation, you need to understand why you're doing it. You need to disclose why you're asking it. And you need to make sure that you are prepared to answer what is the security behind this and who will be able to access that information. Most importantly, you cannot ask about sexual orientation without also asking about gender. These are not the same concepts, so both are important to inquire about. At the end of the day, it is all about intersectionality. Okay. It takes, all of our decisions to take into account financial concerns and toxicities, cultural sensitive approaches to people, and our societal or social constructs as well, as it relates to all the aspects of cancer and cancer treatment, from the prevention of disease all the way to survival and mortality. Intersectionality requires we explicitly think about the ways categories like race, gender, sexuality, and class interact with each other, shapes our sense of ourselves, and how we interact with the world. This is really what it means. And if you're now still wondering why that's important, these are some of the data that shows you how much we do not know. So in addition to the study I reported about Cancer Link, this was the California Health Interview Survey that was conducted by researchers at Boston University. And they could go into a defined database to find this information. So what did they do? They went into these 3 surveys studies from 2001, 3, and 5, where people were asked directly, has anyone ever told you you had cancer? Now, that can mean many things. As I was told I had cancer, but it ended up not being cancer, or I was told about cancer, but I don't really know what that was about. It was 20 years ago. So recall is, has its own issues, is what, I guess, what I would say. Having said that, as a potential limitation, 9% of lesbians reported they had cancer, about similar to bisexual or heterosexual women. Gay men were significantly more likely to report they were told they had cancer. 8% versus 5% with heterosexual people and 5% with bisexual people. And in a study in the U.S. National Cancer Database, which again tried to find gender cancer mismatches as a way to do it, and it had a catchment rate of 0.05%, which is also a severe underestimation. When they looked at the kinds of cancers they were able to sort of uncover, trans people had higher rates of anal, liver, non-melanoma, and lymphoma. Not breast, not prostate cancers. The other issues that we need to know, again, putting on this intersectional lens, is understanding that it's not solely based on being LGBTQ where these disparities arise. If you think intersectionality, several important things come out as well. People in these communities have higher rates of poverty and are less likely to be uninsured in the United States, or less likely to have insurance in the United States. As people in this community age, they're more likely to be single, more likely not to have children, and more likely to be constrained. All of these point to more likely to be isolated. And if you look at the experience, because we do, again, have this black hole in terms of the treatment outcomes, but the OUT survey was done back in 2021 and was analyzed in 2022. And one of the most important things that these people who were parts of this community treated and diagnosed and treated for cancer and we're now in the quote cancer survivorship space. That's who was the candidates for this survey. When they were asked, were you told about your options for fertility preservation? Less than 1 in 5 were given those options for fertility preservation. I find this alarming. And again, it goes back to bias and it goes back to assumptions. But this is directly informs that this is an issue that needs to be addressed. When 82% of people say they do not recall or were not told about issues related to fertility preservation, this is a huge missed equity opportunity. When it comes to transgender people, just as I close, just realize we have no idea how to appropriately, or I should say, optimally manage them after they've been diagnosed with cancer, because many things we do to assess toxicity and to dose treatment is based on the constructs of whether or not someone is male or female, which are biological constructs based on DNA or other harder concrete facts that defines people at birth as male or female. What happens when someone changes their gender, though? If you go on gender affirming hormone therapy, does your biology become more female or does it stay male? Important, because this is how we dose chemotherapy based on renal function, based on body surface area in the middle. And it's also how we look at QT values on an EKG to assess cardiac risks. And then this last slide is from Joe Unger's group at SWOG, Cancer Research Network, showing that women are more likely to experience toxicity when given chemotherapy, immunotherapy, or even targeted treatments. Their risk for toxicity is much higher than it is for men. Is that the same experience with the trans community? We don't know, because there's no way to answer that question proactively. At the end of the day, striving for equity serves as the foundation for diversity and inclusion. It is actually quite critical we try to identify the issues and also try to analyze these issues directly. And it really starts with bringing people who are within these communities out into the open so that we can follow them and report on the differences and the similarities of treatment and outcomes after a cancer diagnosis. So with that, I will close. Thank you so much for letting me speak to you today.